So we would like to get started with our panel. As I mentioned earlier, due to illnesses, we've had two members who couldn't be here, but I'm happy to say that we have Dr. Moghadam, who's agreed to also assist on the panel. But I also would like to take this opportunity to introduce the person who will be the moderator of this panel, who the Baha'i Chair has had the pleasure of having her speak for us about her own research. And her name is Kathleen Cunningham. Dr. Cunningham is in the Department of Government and Politics at the University of Maryland, and the details of her bio are in the program. So I would like to now just introduce you to Dr. Cunningham. Please welcome her.
Well, thank you all for joining. Today I was planning to introduce three fantastic scholars. I'm just going to introduce one fantastic scholar, but thankfully for me, I actually am quite familiar with Dr. Trisko Darden's work on this topic, and I can say personally that this is one of the most fascinating areas, I think, in conflict research that I have seen in the last 10 years. Dr. Trisko Darden is currently at the American Enterprise Institute, where she's researching foreign policy. She has a number of different research projects. The one she's going to speak on today relates to women in conflict. And I will say, as a conflict scholar myself and someone who's familiar with this project, it is hard to overstate how innovative this work is. I was shocked when I first started talking with Jessica about this project that there were fundamental questions that just hadn't been answered in social science about the role of women in conflict processes. So I'm very excited to hear more about it today, and I'm sure you guys will enjoy this talk as well. So thank you. Please welcome Dr. Trisko Darden.
First off, that was a very generous introduction. Thank you.
All true.
Today, I'm going to be speaking about what I termed fighting as women, fighting for women. And this is women's participation in and their unequal roles across armed groups. And in particular, I focus on non-state armed groups. So society's understanding of what it means to be a war fighter is profoundly gendered, as combatants in both civil wars and international conflicts are almost exclusively assumed to be male. The failure to acknowledge that combatants is not synonymous with men stems partly from the difficulty of differentiating in complex environments between civilians and combatants. But yet, even when women are acknowledged to exist as actors in conflict, narratives about their participation either tend to minimize women's agency or to emphasize their exceptionalism and their deviance from accepted gender norms. But women's participation in armed conflict is in fact profoundly normal. While it is true that majority of combatants around the world are male, many women contribute to war fighting and take up arms both in state militaries and in non-state armed groups. Women's experiences of war and their roles within non-state armed groups are far from uniform. They vary at least in part because of the different policies that armed groups adopt regarding female fighters. This talk will draw on research that was conducted as part of my forthcoming book, co-authored with Alexis Henshaw and Ora Suckley, Insurgent Women, Female Combatants in Civil Wars. And the publishers, Georgetown University Press, have very kindly offered an additional discount on this book, which will come out in early 2019. There's a flyer available for you to pick up. But the book broadly examines why women fight, how they fight, and how women help bring an end to fighting. We examine variation in women's roles within and across a range of non-state armed groups. Through a focused, structured comparison of women's roles across ideologically and geographically disparate groups, including the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, the FARC in Colombia, separatist rebel groups in Ukraine, and the PKK in Turkey, our research identifies 6 key conclusions about why women fight, how they fight, and what happens to them when fighting ends that I'll present to you today. But first, for those who are perhaps not familiar with many of these groups, I'm going to go through them and provide some background. So one of the key groups that we analyze is the FARC, the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia. This group was founded in 1964 and currently has a left-wing platform that advocates rights for indigenous peoples within Colombia, women, and LGBTQ populations. It has been estimated over its lifespan to have approximately 30 to 40% of female membership, and numbers roughly 7,000 fighters as of 2016. We also examined the PKK, the Kurdistan Workers' Party, which was founded in 1978. It again is a leftist Kurdish nationalist group that's aiming for Kurdish autonomy, and it's estimated to be roughly 40% female. Its platform emphasizes women's liberation, and this is carried out both in the ideology of the organization as well as its internal policy and structure. The Islamic State in Iraq and Syria originated as an offshoot of Al-Qaeda. As many of you know, it seeks to establish a new Islamic caliphate, and in 2014, importantly, it established all-female brigades, the Al-Khansa and Al-Rayyan, that had women play active roles in policing and coercion within the group. By June 2018, it had recruited nearly 5,000 foreign female members. But we also look at lesser-known groups, such as the Ukrainian separatist rebels fighting in East Ukraine in the regions of Donetsk and Luhansk. And these groups emerged in 2014 following the Russian invasion of that region. Female members in the separatist groups, also referred to as the pro-Russian rebels, typically, tend to be in their 30s and 40s. So they're a relatively older population, they're from those regions, and they have strong familial ties. Looking at these groups, we ask, who joins these? If we look across this array of ideologically, geographically different groups, who joins them? And we conclude that there is no single profile of a female combatant. Women of different ages, religions, ethnicities, social backgrounds, marital status, and a host of other factors all participate in civil wars. Female fighters are a truly global phenomenon. However, individual armed groups may appeal to certain groups or have particular policies with regards to the women that they recruit. Some groups draw from a specified population, as does the PKK from a population of ethnic Kurds. Others, like ISIS, have a relatively open membership, even as they enforce strict regulations on individuals' behaviors within the group. But other demographic factors vary as well. As I mentioned, separatist rebel groups in Ukraine have a much higher average age than, for example, their pro-government counterparts. Women in Ukrainian separatist groups are also more likely to be fighting close to home, while those in pro-government militias hail from the western regions of Ukraine. And while the PKK recruits largely poorly educated rural women, it has also drawn recruits from universities in urban areas. Why do women join these groups? Well, the motivations for joining non-state armed groups and participating in violence vary amongst individual women, just as they do amongst individual men. In all of the groups that we examined, there were women who deeply believed in the platform or the cause of the group and were motivated by that. Indeed, cross-national research has demonstrated that a rebel group's political ideology plays a central role in women's participation. Marxist or leftist-oriented groups have a relatively higher prevalence of female participants, while groups espousing an Islamist ideology have relatively fewer. This finding was mirrored in our analysis of the FARC and another leftist group operating in Colombia, the ELN, as well as Kurdish armed groups in Syria and Turkey. However, our analyses also identified a range of other motivations for women's participation, including a threat to personal security, proximity to the conflict, a desire for autonomy, and close personal connections to others who had taken up arms. our research highlights how some women view their personal security through a gendered lens, and as a result, willingly choose to join armed groups. Disruptions of family life and resulting perceptions of vulnerability often enable women's participation. For instance, in Ukraine, women reported that they felt compelled to join these armed groups when they felt that men were not doing enough to protect their families and their communities. Armed groups may also offer a kind of alternative family network or source of protection. This has been the case in Colombia, where there have been tales of FARC women joining to escape domestic abuse and hopelessness, and these narratives should be taken seriously, as should stories coming out of the PKK from young women who have joined to avoid early or forced marriage and gain greater personal agency. The concerns of widows and other female heads of households who seek economic opportunities or social support in the arms of a militant group must also be acknowledged. Forced recruitment and trafficking are also another significant pathway for women into some armed groups, as has been the case with Al-Shabaab, Boko Haram, and ISIS. Once in an armed group, what roles do women take on? We found that they serve in a broad range of roles, including as fighters. In most cases, groups have made clear and binary yes or no decisions about whether or not to permit women in combat roles, though these decisions may be subject to change over time. In the case of the PKK in Turkey, women's equality in leadership and in participation is enshrined in its policies. Women in Ukrainian armed groups appear to be universally trained in handling arms. However, the relative balance in women's participation between support roles versus combat roles varies widely across groups. Only limited evidence suggests that women in Ukrainian separatist groups have actually engaged in armed combat against the Ukrainian military. Rather, they're more likely to be found staffing checkpoints or serving in logistical and support roles, including as military medics. In Colombia, women were initially mobilized into the FARC alongside their families. They performed supporting roles, cooking food, maintaining camp, taking care of children. Only later were women actively accepted as fighters. And unlike other Kurdish armed groups, women play a relatively limited role in the Iraqi Kurdish forces, collectively known as the Peshmerga. But even when women take on combat or coercive roles, the actual forms of violence that they participate in can vary widely. Take ISIS, for instance. The first confirmed report of an ISIS female fighter was in February 2016. But unconfirmed reports of ISIS female fighters in Syria date back to July 2014. The two all-female ISIS police units are often seen as quasi-military in nature. They also play important propaganda roles, as displayed in the photo. But it is probable that more women in ISIS would have taken on combat roles if they had been allowed to do so. Indeed, one recruit from the West expressed disappointment in not being allowed to fight, despite the fact that she had experience serving in the British military. These limitations placed on women's ability to engage in violence can be directly compared to Boko Haram, another Islamist Salafist group operating in Nigeria. One study of Boko Haram found that at least 56% of the group's suicide bombers from 2011 to 2017 were female. The majority of suicide bombers in Boko Haram are women and children. And while women and girls have played an outsized role in these suicide attacks, few to none have taken on traditional combat roles. In contrast, almost no women have been implicated in attacks by Al-Shabaab, another Salafist group operating in Somalia. Women in Al-Shabaab, who are both trafficked into and voluntarily join the group, serve primarily in support roles, as wives and mothers, preparing food, collecting firewood, providing medical care, and sheltering or hiding other members. Women outside of Somalia and Kenya have also played an active role in financing Al-Shabaab's activities. Another major finding is that the degree to which armed groups explicitly appeal to women, especially in recruitment, is an outgrowth of women's participation in the group itself. Women have played key roles as recruiters and propagandists, serving as a vehicle for the recruitment of other women. But we also find that the adoption of a gender rights platform is the product of the engagement and advancement of women within a group like the FARC. That is, it is an internal rather than a top-down maneuver. In the case of the FARC, the organization grew and changed significantly during the period from about 1970 to 1982. As commercial agriculture expanded in Colombia, more rural populations were displaced, and the FARC's ranks swelled. This growth necessitated organizational change, and the FARC established a military-style hierarchy, complete with rules of conduct, and revised its political program. There was initially some resistance to expanding the role of women within the FARC, but decisions at its 6th conference in 1978 and 7th conference in 1982 ultimately allowed women to enlist in the new military organization. A declaration in 1985 formally recognized equality between male and female guerrillas, which opened up new opportunities for women in the FARC. This evolution occurred in the context of competition with the ELN, another leftist armed group in Colombia, which had gender rights in its manifesto as early as 1965. In comparison, the liberation of women constitutes a core tenet of the PKK's ideology and a central component of the political education all fighters receive. Women have been part of the PKK since it was founded, and today, by policy, all political leadership positions must be jointly held by a man and a woman who are co-elected. Perhaps even more unusual, this emphasis in gender parity is also reflected in the military wing. In the late 1980s and 1990s, the armed wing began accepting large numbers of female recruits, today estimated to be roughly 40% of the organization's fighters. Men and women fight in integrated units, and this early involvement of the women in the PKK politically meant that when the Turkish crackdown on the Kurdish regions of Turkey occurred in the 1990s and politicized many women, the PKK already existed as an organization that was willing to accept and recruit them. We also find evidence from a range of cases that women willingly participate in non-state armed groups, even when those groups are hostile to or victimize women. The FARC's policy of forced abortion and contraception is the clearest example of what is a relatively egalitarian group maintaining policies that directly discriminates against women and limits their ability to make their own decisions. But women in ISIS have also promoted policies that discriminate against women. On social media, female ISIS supporters have been quick to advocate for the extreme violence that ISIS carries out and have worked to recruit other women. In ISIS's English glossy magazine, Al-Dabiq, a female reporter named Al-Muhajira published a full-throated defense of ISIS's policy of enslaving women and girls. The continued presence of women amongst suicide bombers in the PKK, Boko Haram, and other groups also raises important questions about women's agency within non-state armed groups. But it is important to note that this isn't a problem with Islamist or leftist ideology. Women also actively participate in fascist and neo-Nazi groups that are hostile to women and minorities. This is the case in Ukraine, where Ukrainian ultra-nationalist militias and women who've been leading spokespersons for those groups have called for the eradication of all Russian speakers. So what happens when women in these groups seek to leave? We find that female ex-combatants are doubly stigmatized. Right? When conflict ends or when a woman defects, she is identified first as a fallen or a compromised woman, and secondly, as a fighter. Women also face additional stigma from transgressing cultural or social norms, and this is particularly true for women from indigenous or rural communities. For instance, the Communist Party of Nepal Maoist armed wing promoted intercaste marriages amongst its members. And following the peace accord, many of these relationships dissolved as members were faced with social stigma in their home communities. But DDR processes, disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration programs can also trap women in traditional social norms. For example, years of stories about abortion and promiscuity in the FARC has created the perception that female FARC members, FARistas, are women of loose morals. And yet, even then, there are social pressures for them to return to traditional roles as homemakers and caregivers. In fact, with the FARC no longer controlling their fertility, many FARistas have become pregnant or given birth at demobilization sites, while others have returned to their communities to look for children they were forced to surrender during the war. A new phenomenon that has emerged in recent years is the question of what to do with women who are captured during conflict. Many countries, including our own, are confronting the challenge of dealing with women who supported ISIS. Responses to these women have varied widely, with some countries dealing out harsh punishments. For instance, in Iraq, hundreds of ISIS women were arrested after the fall of Mosul and other ISIS-held territories, and dozens went on trial earlier this year. Some of these women have claimed that they were duped into joining ISIS by their husbands or parents and that they collaborated with the organization to survive. In choosing this narrative, women are appealing to a common frame, that they are victims of conflict. And while there is evidence that many women were forced into the group by family members and circumstances, this does not preclude the fact that some women joined as willing, ideologically committed participants. In Iraq, at least, many women have been unsuccessful in using being misled as a legal defense. Dozens have been given sentences of death or life in prison, including women from Turkey, Azerbaijan, Russia, and Germany. The pace of these trials in the Iraqi legal system, some of which have been as short as 10 minutes, and a perceived difference in the treatment of Iraqi versus foreign national women has sparked outcry from human rights organizations. At the same time, it's unclear what a lenient approach to these women might look like. The United Kingdom has revoked the citizenship of 150 would-be returnees to prevent them from re-entering the country. Whereas the Canadian government has argued that it must bring home everyone linked to ISIS, even though these individuals are unlikely to be convicted in Canadian courts due to the lack of evidence. France has promised that women and children who wish to return will have their petitions reviewed on a case-by-case basis. But in practice, the French government has allowed foreign courts to try French nationals and has appeared to make little or no proactive effort to extradite French citizens. Given the numbers of countries involved, there's likely to be a patchwork of policies with respect to returning ISIS supporters, both male and female. So how should policy adapt to this challenge? Right? The first step is to acknowledge that women play important and often active roles in armed conflict. To date, because their roles vary so widely, women are often designated as non-combatants in DDR processes and excluded. Even when they are included and recognized as participants in armed conflict, their demobilization programs often focus on developing domestic skills, such as sewing, rather than focusing on the skills that they developed or the duties that they played while being a member of an armed group. So not only do we need to expand our post-conflict processes to include these women, we also need to acknowledge that they play a range of roles and tailor policies accordingly. But policy also needs to do better in recognizing that women face different vulnerabilities than men and may need additional reintegration support. So for instance, in dealing with women who have escaped from Boko Haram, the Nigerian government has effectively placed many of these women in residential programs where they're cut off from their communities, their families, and oftentimes the children that they had prior to or while they were associated with the group. This isn't a strategy for rebuilding and reconnecting these women with their societies. And so while we need to balance out the security concerns, very little attention has been drawn to the fact that we are not focused on reincorporating women into communities. We also need to understand that women's participation in peace processes is not sufficient to ensure positive outcomes. So when the FARC concluded the Havana peace talks and reached an agreement with the Colombian government that would lead to the group's demobilization and transition to a political party in Colombia, a lot of attention, particularly by those who have been focused on the women, peace, and security agenda, pointed to the fact that the FARC had high-level female participants in the peace talks, including one foreigner, I believe she was Dutch, who got a lot of attention for her participation in the group. However, women's involvement in the Havana peace talks and the ensuing peace process has not meant that women in Colombia have better than average outcomes in terms of their reintegration. Many women have left the demobilization camps. And while there is evidence that Colombian women are less likely to rejoin an armed group than men, they're also much less likely to demobilize. And so something in the current demobilization process in Colombia is not benefiting women to the degree that we would like to see, and I'm happy to go into that more. But overall, I think that we like to see and we like to frame women as peacemakers, as conciliatory, as consensus leaders, as consensus builders. And while that may all be true, it is also true that women are active contributors to armed conflict, whether that's through direct participation in combat or through the myriad support roles that women play in financing and recruiting and propaganda, and assisting the day-to-day lives of male fighters. And so I ask that we take a more holistic picture of how women's inequality and equality is conceived. And so much attention has been put in this country on the removal of the combat restriction for women with no exceptions. And so while that has been a kind of long and ongoing process within the United States, formal equality of access to opportunity, right, doesn't mean equality in outcomes. And I think that is the most important lesson to be learned from my research, that even though women and men may take on relatively equal positions within some armed groups, that their outcomes do not have that same level of equality. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this fascinating talk on women, gender, and rebel groups. We're going to invite now the audience to ask questions. And what I'd like you to do is step forward to the central microphone and please identify yourself before asking your question.
Good morning, this is Lawrence again. Have there been any longitudinal or longer-term follow-up studies of the women after reintegration in any of these instances?
So I think the microphone is off there, but the question was about, is it on? Oh.
The question is, have there been any longer-term studies after reintegration of the impact of women being involved in combat, the impact on themselves, on their families, and their communities?
So women's actual acceptance into these reintegration programs is relatively recent. The case in which we have the most data is the process in El Salvador. And what has come out of El Salvador is that, similar to what is seen in Colombia, that women were, the process treated women based on the prevailing social expectations within the country. So, as is the case in Colombia, women were expected to return to their kind of typical domestic lives and were given resources to lead to that outcome. So for instance, you often hear stories about women who received sewing machines as part of the demobilization process, selling those sewing machines and trying to use the capital to do something kind of more productive or perhaps out of the box. But I think what is interesting is that El Salvador and Colombia are really the only two cases we have where women were actively involved in the peace process themselves. And I think there has been this argument promoted by the Women, Peace and Security Agenda and others that the more women come to the negotiating table, the more women are involved in the peace process, the more durable the peace will be. And unfortunately, we haven't had a significant enough period of time since these processes have played out to, I think, actually empirically assess that. Do you want to add? You're welcome to add.
That's all right. We can get a couple, and then I've got some questions.
All right, thanks very much to both of you. These were really thought-provoking talks. I didn't identify. I'm Jen Larson. I'm a professor at Vanderbilt University. I was curious how these two combine, which is to say, to what extent does a feminist understanding of international interstate politics depend on an assumption that women aren't militarized or interested in combat and fighting? And to what extent do you think at the level of civil conflict, the fighting that we observe would be different if women had, say, been excluded from fighting and from combat roles, or if more women were present? Like, to what extent do these two combine?
Very nice.
Thanks.
Okay. Do you want to answer that, and then I can also take it? Sure.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. So we do have some evidence of variation in the number of women participating in rebel groups, even within a single conflict. So for instance, if we look at Kurdish rebel groups that have responded to ISIS in Turkey, but also in Iraq and Syria, and associated Kurdish groups in Iran, we see that women's participation in those rebel groups varies quite significantly. So in the PKK, the group operating in Turkey, women are estimated to be 40% of those groups. But for instance, in the Kurdish armed groups, PJAK in Iran, women participate, but there is relatively limited female participation in those groups. And so while all of these groups do have female participation, there's pretty significant variation. What we've seen in terms of the conflict with ISIS in Iraq and Syria is that those groups with high levels of female participation have been really active in using that as a propaganda tool to confront ISIS's ideology and message. So you get these kind of titles played out in the West about, you know, those badass Kurdish women confronting ISIS, and it's been quite popular in the Western press. I can't speak to the local press, but I think what it has done is emboldened those groups in the sense that they feel like their social values and their ideology is superior to the group that they're engaged with. And they're using that not only as a kind of propaganda tool, but also to mobilize other fighters, right? So we don't want ISIS to impose its values on our people. We know what happened to other minority groups under that. We're going to mobilize and we're going to fight. And their willingness to use female fighters, I think, really helps activate mobilization. And so in my mind, that's really key, that if you have half of your population that's a potential labor force and a potential support force, and you're actively dissuading that population from joining your group, I do think it's going to affect your success. The difficulty is that there have traditionally been these porous boundaries between rebel group membership, individuals who are under the control or living in the territory controlled by rebel groups, and those who have no affiliation. So it's very difficult to draw hard lines between active membership in a group, more distant support for a group, and kind of proximity to the group. So what we focused on in our study are self-identified group members who wear kind of military insignia, or other tools, but I think that it's clear that women's support is necessary for the vitality of a rebel group. And we've seen this. Colombia has been one of the longest running insurgencies, and this has been very arguably because they drew on the female population not only in support but in military roles.
You know, our presentations, I think, complemented each other very, very nicely, because I was focused on macro politics and the role of women peacemakers and peace builders, and the feminist critique of militarism. But of course, we do know that women have been involved in revolutionary movements, and that entails taking up arms for quite some time. There's a rich literature, it's a sociological literature, and there's some feminist political scientists who've written about women in the armed revolutionary movements of, for example, El Salvador and Nicaragua. So the work of Jocelyn Viterna at Harvard, and also Karen Kampworth, and Norma Chinchilla, and women like that. We know that women have taken part in revolutions since the French Revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution, all kinds of revolutions, and they've picked up arms in World War II. Soviet women were very much involved both in fighting and also in flying pilot jets. They were popularly known as the night witches, and the German soldiers were actually scared to death of them. So we do know that women have taken part in armed revolutionary struggles and in armed groups, for quite some time. The Eritreans, the work of Dan Connell and others, showed also that there was something like 30% of the fighters in Eritrea were women. But you're right that afterwards, the outcomes were not so great, and a lot of Eritrean women that Dan Connell interviewed afterwards very much complained about the roles that they were, relegated to. Not necessarily the case in Nicaragua, but there you go. So I think what comes out of your research, and what I think we know already, is that ideology matters. And where you have left-wing groups that are also motivated by a kind of gender egalitarian ideology, you have more women participants in these revolutionary struggles and in combat roles. I mean, even in Palestine, there were a number of fighting groups in Palestine, but the largest number of women fighters and women militants were in the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine, which was popularly known as the Jibhe Nissa, the Women's Front, precisely because of the large number of women there and because of the Democratic Front's pro-women's rights agenda, you see. And there was another left-wing group, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the PFLP, but that was a little bit more, less women-friendly, let's put it that way. But the Democratic Front was part of that. It had close ties to the Soviet Union, the socialist countries and such, so had been very much inspired by that kind of ideology. So therefore, it had more, women fighters and such. Tamil Tigers had a lot of these suicide, women fighters too. So we know about the agency of women in revolutionary struggles, and also in some of the nastier ones too, like the Tamil Tiger suicide and the, what were they called, the Black Widows of Chechnya. Your policy, and I've met some of the those wonderful Kurdish fighters, by the way. I had the pleasure of meeting some of them in Beirut, and they are very, very committed to to a feminist project, actually. That's not the case, of course, with the ISIS women. And so I wanted to ask you two things. I think I've answered your question, so the complementarity, but also the knowledge that that women do engage in revolutionary battles. But ideologies certainly matters in terms of the roles that women play, the proportions, and then how they're treated also. The policy. I'm not that sympathetic to the women who are drawn to ISIS or to Boko Haram, and I know that there are different views on that subject, but I don't know. I mean, that was a choice that they made. I think it was an absolutely dreadful choice. There's your agency, by the way. They weren't victims. That's different from the women of, let's say, Boko Haram who were kidnapped. That's very different. But the ones who choose to join such criminal, activities, I don't know, my dear. So I'd like to hear more from you about the policy side of things and how to rehabilitate women like that, if at all. But secondly, could you tell us a little bit more about your methodology and your sources of information and data?
So we do have one question also waiting here. More than one. You're not late. You're just sitting down. So perhaps why don't we take 3 questions, and then since there's so much great content here, give Dr. Trisko Darden a chance to respond. Yeah.
Thanks very much for your presentation. I enjoyed it very much. I think there are a couple of things that are left out in your analysis. Let's start with the first. There were a number of conflicts in which women were drawn into conflicts in Sierra Leone, Liberia, Cote d'Ivoire, and there's also been a pretty long history now of rehabilitation through DDR in those 3 areas in particular. So I think it's a little bit. I think you need to go back into the history a little bit more to see how. These women were sort of reintegrated back into society, and some of the problems that occur as a result of that rehabilitation. For example, not only did they not have traditional lives to go back to, because once they've gone into the armed forces or the rebel forces, it's very difficult for them to go back into sort of traditional roles in the society. So that's one of the problems that they have. And you mentioned that the fact that they might be treated differently by their compatriots when they get back, because they're treated as sort of discarded women in some ways, women who were despoiled women as a result of being part of the military or the armed forces. But I think there's a lot more nuance in terms of why women join armed forces and terrorist organizations in particular. We know that, for example, there have been 150 female suicide bombers in the last 15 years. So this is a new development, relatively new development, really, with the increase in number of female suicide bombings occurring in the world. And the reasons for those women becoming members of terrorist organizations varies tremendously. There's not a monolithic reason. There's several different reasons. So it'd be interesting if you could give us some idea of what you think some of those reasons are, and also to talk a little bit about the reintegration of women back into society, especially in those conflicts in Africa where it was a very big deal about 15, 20 years ago.
Thank you. Can we go ahead and take 2 more questions, please? I'll let you guys duke it out for who gets up to the microphone. And please introduce yourself as well. Thank you.
Sure. My name is Negar Abai with the Bahá'í Office of Public Affairs. Thank you both for your presentation and for, as you say, illuminating things at the macro and sort of on the ground level. I similarly felt there's a lot of historical and ethnographic work that could add richness and nuance to this conversation. It'd be good to bring that in. But and I think there's also research that has looked longer duration and suggests that there have been sort of longer lasting peace outcomes with the participation of women. And so it'd be nice to be a little more in conversation with that, and maybe it's a question of methodology. But my question in particular was, I understood in what Dr. Darden was presenting that part of what you're suggesting is that the mere presence or representation of women doesn't allow for equitable outcomes, neither within armed conflicts and then post-conflict, what that society looks like, nor in the peace process. And so I was wondering if actually both of you could speak a little more to what you understand would allow for an actual transformative outcome. I mean, what does that look like if the presence of women on both those sides is not actually translating into any difference?
Great. Thank you. We'll take one more question and then give them an opportunity to speak as well.
want to hear more about children born in these women who are in those rebel groups. And also, it would be nice to hear those people, women involved in those groups, telling their story. Because again, we're always being fed by people who are coming from outside, telling the stories of these people. Is there a movement which really can be used to tell the women themselves to tell their story? Because I know I rehabilitated 4 teenagers after the Sierra Leonean War, married to a Sierra Leonean. And if you hear those stories from those women, it will be totally different from what maybe you write. Them getting to the world stage and telling their stories. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Why don't we spend a little bit of time addressing these questions, and I know we have a lot of people who would still like to ask too. If I start giving you the eye, it's to get more conversation going.
So that question about women's voices and the representation of women's voices also connects to the question of methodology. So our study focused on active and ongoing conflicts in which women play a significant role in rebel groups. And we do, obviously in the course of the book, address these other conflicts and what we learn from those in addition to our cases. But the question of women's voices and participants' voices was at the center of our research. So our methodology involved comparative case studies of these 3 conflicts, the ongoing civil war in Ukraine, looking at both the participation of pro-Russian separatist rebel groups, but also pro-Ukrainian government groups and women's participation in both of those armed factions. We looked at the conflict in the Kurdish regions against ISIS. Again, we looked not only at the PKK, but other Kurdish groups active in that conflict, and also at the FARC and the ALN in Colombia. And in drawing on women's voices, we looked first at the FARC has an archive that's available online. It's called SEDEMA, and these are the writings of female FARC members and interviews with female FARC members that are now publicly available and hosted for anyone from the public to engage with. So we did very much look at women's narratives. In terms of the Ukraine conflict, we looked at press reports, but also blogs and YouTube videos. There are many interviews with female combatants, both in Russian and Ukrainian, that I got to watch. It was really fun. My colleagues wondered what I was doing most of the time, but I watched hundreds of hours of these videos, which are, to be fair, mostly propaganda videos. They're put out for public consumption and have a particular message, but many of those videos are very much focused on women telling their own narratives, why they joined the conflict. Some of them, for example, are simply women kind of driving around, doing their patrols, speaking with an interviewer, going through their daily routines. Some are much more propagandistic, of showing women at firing ranges and doing military-style drills and things like that. In the case of the Kurdish groups, my co-author, Ora Suckley, conducted interviews with Kurdish activists in Germany, also in Lebanon, and also relied on prior research that had been done on those groups, but she's a very active an ongoing research agenda on Kurdish armed groups, of which this was one aspect. No. And so we do feel like in the longer book that we do represent women's voices, but also to acknowledge that women's voices are often competing and conflictual and contradictory, right? There is no single narrative of why women joined and what it meant to them to participate, and I think we really tried to highlight that. So for example, one combatant that fought for the Ukrainian government in eastern Ukraine, Vita Zavercha, was profiled by Elle France. She was repeatedly crops up in media interviews. She's also a hardcore neo-Nazi. and has also engaged in criminal acts. She held up a gas station. She beat up some transgendered individuals in Kiev. So these women are complex people. And so it is very difficult to obviously distill that to some PowerPoint bullets, and I acknowledge that, but also this is the exercise that we engage in. On the question of conflicts that we left out, yes, there's been excellent work done on Sierra Leone in particular. My colleague Susan Scheppeler at the School of International Service has written a book that focuses specifically on girl soldiers. In that conflict, Megan McKenzie has also done a lot of work on that. Also, this is an ongoing issue. So, for example, the LRA kidnapped 20,000 children from 1987 onwards. There are currently an estimated 12,000 child soldiers operating in South Sudan. And the Obama administration gave the South Sudanese government a waiver despite knowledge of these child soldiers, so we could continue providing military assistance to that government. So this is clearly an ongoing challenge. A lot of the work on reintegration of children has also focused on the conflict in Rwanda and how there's multi-generational trauma as a result of that conflict. And so I think that is a very interesting emerging area of research, the idea of kind of multi-generational trauma and reintegration and how to account for that in reintegration processes. But as I am not personally an expert on Sierra Leone or Liberia, I can only talk about that within the broader context of how do we integrate children more broadly. And I think that this has, currently, is a significant issue for the reintegration of children, for lack of a better way of phrasing this, linked to ISIS, right? So currently, we have about 1,100 children in detention in Iraq because their dad was an ISIS fighter or their mom was swept up after Mosul fell. And those are the foreigners, right? So the Iraqi children are being placed in Iraqi orphanages. NPR did an excellent story recently on this about the state of those orphanages and the future possibilities for the children who are there. And obviously, as we can imagine, it's not good. And so I think that there's the question of, how does this play out in terms of formal policy, and then how does this play out in terms of what we can do on the ground now? And so I'm very much concerned about what we can do on the ground now. So for instance, Germany has made an active effort to repatriate all children that can be plausibly linked to German citizenship that are in Iraq and Syria. Oddly enough, Russia has also taken a lead in this in repatriating ethnically Chechen children from Iraq and Syria. That has been one approach, but the fact that Russia and Germany are taking the lead there, I think should give many people pause, because those were not the countries that had the majority of foreign fighters. Right, countries like Tunisia had the highest per capita. We have Kosovars. It's a problem for roughly, I think, 25 countries. And so while it's useful to have the civil wars in Liberia and Sierra Leone and elsewhere kind of inform that, I think that the current conflict environment is very complex. And I actually agree with you that most of the individuals, at least in the US government and the UN, who are working on what has been dubbed the foreign terrorist fighter problem, are not looking to those cases, and they should be, right? We have lots of examples of successful DDR efforts. Tajikistan, for example, that's one case where, although women weren't heavily involved as fighters, it's had a very durable peace outcome. And so we can look to those cases, but unfortunately, policymakers aren't. And so I think that even though we have gaps, obviously, in what we cover, we can't do, doing an analysis of every DDR program would be a different project, and one that is certainly worthwhile. We do try and point to solutions for kind of ongoing policy challenges faced by the US government and others.
Could you just speak a little bit more about I think one of the questions was on the role of women specifically, so that was a great analysis of the process for children. But if we are seeing women at the table or in the process, and it's not matching up with our desired expectations, do you have a few thoughts on that as well?
So I certainly don't want to leave the impression that I don't think that having women at the table is a good first step. I think it is an important step. It is a very positive step. And in the case of El Salvador, it really led to the formal incorporation of women's and gender issues into the peace process in terms of the agreements that resulted. That has been less the case in Colombia, although it's not clear why. But I think that we now have this kind of widespread consensus that women need to have a place at the negotiating table, combined with a broader women, peace, and security agenda that is highlighting the fact that we need to do more to ensure that women have positive outcomes. I think that there are several ways that this could be achieved, and one is the explicit recognition of the dual role or tripartite role that women play, both as socially the heads of households, parents, mothers, educators, that kind of social responsibility role of women, and taking that more seriously, but also taking seriously women as economic contributors. And I think this is what personally drives me nuts about a lot of these programs, is that they don't treat women's active engagement in the economy in the same way as they treat men's. And sometimes they don't do a good job with men either. So for instance, you have some DDR programs where men are being, taught to make handicrafts that they're then gonna sell on the side of the road to tourists. I don't think that's sustainable engagement in the economy either. So I think we need to take both men and women's economic roles much, much more seriously in DDR processes. I'm a avowed capitalist, I would say, but also to recognize that women's experiences in these groups are very likely more heterogeneous than men's experiences in these groups, right? That particularly in groups like the FARC and others, where women have kind of specific sexual and other roles, social roles within these groups, that women's experiences of that are going to vary more significantly than perhaps men's do, and to address those as well. So for instance, when I think of what it would be like to be a demobilized female FARC fighter versus a male FARC fighter, right, as evidenced by the kind of spike in pregnancies that's occurred in the demobilization camps, right? That's direct evidence of how being demobilized from that group affects men and women differently, right? And that women have to bear kind of the social responsibility of pregnancy or is really obvious, but I don't think it's one that was anticipated, right? So the idea that the Colombian state would take on the provision of contraception in the same way that the FARC as an organization took on the provision of contraception was not something that was publicly acceptable in Colombian society, and maybe it was just never seriously considered, right? But when you have lived and operated under a particular type of social structure and you find yourself thrust out of that, there are going to be very real consequences. And I'm sure we could point to many others, but this to me is a very compelling piece of evidence.
Mm-hmm. That's really interesting. I mean, I think your research is just so fascinating. But I was under the impression that actually there was not a high rate of pregnancy within FARC. And during the fighting, when
it's currently in the demobilization camps.
In the demobilization camps. I see. That is a different story. Yeah, that's great. I wonder if, in terms of the outcomes for women, I mean, some of the issues that are being raised all the time everywhere are, women's policy agencies, which actually were created in Nicaragua and El Salvador. Sorry. Thank you. And gender budgets and things like, electoral quotas. But I think what becomes really important, and you were right, absolutely right, to point out that women's experiences are more heterogeneous than men's experiences, because although not all men do well, after the conflict, it is true that they are more likely to take on various other roles, whether it's in the labor force or in the political parties or in government. And especially if that movement, that armed movement, has won the battle, then you will see those male fighters in positions of authority, and more so than women. And I think, though, that in a post-feminist era, we might actually see some different outcomes, especially with Colombia, with FARC, and with the PKK. I think it's still early days for FARC, to be sure, but I think we should wait at least another 5 years or so and see, first of all, how does this peace process work out within the country as a whole, but also to see the extent to which the society and the former male fighters recognize that women played an important role in FARC, and they are deserving of an equal place at the table, whether that table is in the political party or it's in government or it's in. So I think there might be different outcomes in this feminist or post-feminist era than, for example, for women who were fighters in the 1960s, 70s, and even in the 80s. I don't know. That's just, a hypothesis. But excellent, really, really excellent work. About 2 or 3 years ago, I was marginally involved in a project that had to do with what is it that attracts women to ISIS. But yours is quite wide-ranging, and it's just very, very good. Yeah.
Thank you both. Let's go ahead and take another set of questions. So if we could have a few people come up to the microphone. Please remember to identify yourself and ask your question. Thanks.
My name is Tamara Lawrence. I have 2 comments, and I'd like to share a resource. My comment is, my first one is, drawing on Patrick Coburn's work, that great independent journalist that is based in the Middle East, mostly in Iraq, who wrote the book on the rise of ISIS. He attributes the rise of ISIS directly to the U.S. illegal invasion of Iraq. And when the U.S. came in, they dismantled the Ba'athist Sunni army and police forces. So ISIS is largely comprised of jobless, former Ba'athist police officers and military officers. The United States right now is propping up a Shia minority government in Iraq that is not representative and that does not have legitimacy to the people. And even Obama admitted a few years ago that ISIS is a direct response, is a direct outcome for the U.S. invasion. And then just to remind ourselves of the brutal attacks by the U.S. on Mosul and Fallujah. My other comment is I'd like to just provide a Canadian perspective about women in the military. Canada is one of the first Western countries to open up all roles, including combat, to women. So in 1987, every single job, was open except for on submarines, and that came to be in 2000. So all positions are open to women in the military, but women only occupy 14% of the military right now. Women aren't joining the military in Canada, despite all positions being open to them. The Canadian military right now has a target by 2026 for 25% of women to join the military, but they won't. In 2015, there was an external review of the Canadian military about sexual misconduct in the military, and it found that there's universal, 100%, women are experiencing sexual harassment in the military and high levels of sexual assault. The key finding was that there is a highly sexualized culture that is hostile to women in the Canadian military. And this month, a new report from the military showed that there are record levels of sexual assault, over 100 sexual assaults, and over 200 sexual misconduct. So women aren't joining, and they don't want to join, and they're not going to meet the target. And then finally, I would like to share a resource, and that is the excellent book by Helen Benedict that journalism professor at Columbia University. She wrote an excellent book about women's experiences in the US military, and it's called The Lonely Soldier, the private war against women in serving in Iraq, and I just encourage people to check it out. Thanks.
Great, thank you.
This is really fascinating work. And the intersection between the longer presentation and then this newer work is really wonderful. I'm wondering about what has been learned over time. I'm thinking back to the late 1980s, the early 1990s. There was an extensive set of projects looking at women's military participation in conflicts in different parts of the world. I remember one of the volumes that came out of this was the one that Marianne Tetro edited about Asia, Africa, and Latin America. And I was wondering if either of you could comment on what has been learned that is different in this, if anything, in the new research, the new conflicts, and if there is anything different in the research that you and your collaborators are doing. Is it because the conflicts that you're looking at, these ongoing conflicts, are somehow different than the longer historical studies, which really sort of do go back to into the 19th century? Or is it because of some way that you have looked differently at them? So that's question number one. And another sort of quick question is, and this probably goes back to some of the things that Professor Knight was talking about. The United Nations does evaluation studies of its various projects in different parts of the world. And I suspect Professor Knight has looked at some of these, but I certainly have. I've looked at demobilization projects for women in Liberia and Sierra Leone and Timor-Leste, and perhaps even contributed to some of those projects. And I was wondering if those studies have informed any of the work that you're doing in terms of your evaluations, and if there have, are there themes that your evaluations seem to be that are different from the kinds of themes that have been brought up by the Secretary General's office or UNDP? Thank you.
Thank you. Let's take just two more, and then we'll have a chance for answers here.
Hi, my name is Ben, former UMD student, and currently working for a USAID contractor. I just had a kind of brief question. It's maybe too soon to ask this question, but obviously you've discussed that there are a lot of DDR programs going throughout different countries around the world at the moment. I was just wondering if there's, when women who come back from different conflicts, especially from countries who have a lot of women and men traveling to different conflicts all over the world, when they are, if the DDR program allowed back into their country, are they being treated all the same? Like, is the overall DDR program the same for women from any conflict, or is there any customization by the specific conflict that women are involved in? Thank you.
Thank you.
First of all, I want to say that this morning has really been a very powerful set of presentations, and I appreciate all of what you've presented. Thank you. When we do studies, we tend to want to zoom in and pick out the details and see what's going on, and sometimes we really need to zoom out a little bit and look at a bigger picture. From 76 to 79, I was a Peace Corps volunteer in El Salvador during the Civil War in a small indigenous village. As luck would have it, I ended up as country deputy director for Peace Corps from 2009 to 13 in the middle of the MS-13 and 18th Street gang wars, when we had the highest murder rate of any country outside of war zones in the world. And I just wanted to relate some things that I learned during those experiences that sort of confirm what was said, and at the same time raise questions about how we study and what to include. I was not alive when the stock market crashed, although some people think I was. But we all know that it crashed, and we're all aware of sort of what it did here. But the weight of irresponsibility, economic irresponsibility, is on the weight of the people that do it. So that weight is on our shoulders in this country. But when it crashed in El Salvador, the reaction was that because all land was owned by a dozen families or less, and they grew sugar, and they grew cotton, and they grew coffee, and there was no market, they decided not to plant the next year because there would be no market. In the area that I lived in, which was the valley running from Sonsonate up towards Huachapan, the workers and the farmers went to the owners and said, we need help. Well, in Latin America, there's a social contract that's always existed. So you didn't have Social Security. You worked for next to nothing, but when your child was sick or needed school, your patron, the one that owned the place, would take care of you. That was a social contract. The social contract was broken that year. And the owner said, go home. We can't plant. Come back next year. And those workers knew that they couldn't even last a month without subsistence. And it was the perfect storm because we had fear of socialism, communism in the end of the 20s, and we had the economic crash, and then we had the fear going on there. And so what happened was the workers, of course, started to rally and go up against the farm owners, and that resulted in the General Martinez, the head of El Salvador, sending in the troops that killed 60,000 Pipil Indian men in 10 days, between 12 and 60 years old. That's 2 to 3 generations of men. Now, the effect on women. So our depression marginalized all the women and children of the Pipil tribe because they lost their breadwinners. They lost culture. They lost genetic. They lost all kinds of things. So that event was the genesis of the Civil War in the 70s and 80s. It was direct result. When I arrived, I actually had firsthand witnesses alive that told me about those 10 days as they sat in a tree as a child waiting for the armies to go down. So I got to hear those stories. I got to see the result of that. I also was in the middle of the Civil War, so I observed the harvest of that. That was the harvest of the Depression. And so, we had death squads, kidnappings, torture. We had all kinds of things going on, as everybody knows. So then what happened was I also witnessed that when the teenagers would see their families tortured, raped, and murdered in the countryside, they had two choices. They were the only one alive, so they either had to go to the mountains and be in guerrilla or go to L.A. The ones that went to L.A. were beat up by the Mexican gangs. So they decided to organize, and that's where MS-13 came. Later, I was told, after an interview with one of the former leaders of the MS-13, we learned our ability to deal with violence in the Civil War. Our insensitivity to violence was learned in the Civil War. Organizational skills were learned in LA. So then that puts me up now to when I go back as Deputy Director for Peace Corps. I helped carry the coffin of the daughter, 14-year-old daughter of one of my workers. It was executed when they were done with her. So once again, you see this continuing effect, the Depression, the massacre, the war, then the gangs. Now, yes, women's rights were considered during the Acuerdos de Paz, the agreements of peace, not a peace treaty. It's an agreement. But the people that run Congress are the ex-comandantes, the ex-generals, the ex-officers, and while they were in Congress, a woman who had a miscarriage is now serving prison for murder. So what they did was they took care of those nice programs, but they drifted back into marginalizing women again I'm guessing that even though El Salvador was sort of more progressive in the peace agreements and considering women, that didn't protect them from going backwards because of the folks that were really making the rules.
Right, including right-wing parties.
Yeah, so it's confirming what you were talking about when the war's over, the men take over the rulemaking. So
But I think this is an important point, though, about how
I'm
these
bringing this up
agreements
that
are embedded
we really
in
have to
existing
watch out because
cultures.
Colombia is actually more progressive and probably wouldn't imprison a woman for a miscarriage. El Salvador is still that way. So it's not, sometimes to really see things, we really have to take a wider view. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's give a chance to respond now.
Yeah, I mean, the incident in 1932 that was just mentioned was the La Matanza massacre, and so this is a well-documented, often framed as a peasant rebellion or revolt that was brutally put down by the Salvadoran government. And that was the first of a kind of wave of series of incidents of government repression within that country. But I think the broader point about how difficult it is to actually shift social norms, particularly relating to gender inequality and women's rights issues, is very well identified. And in the sense that all of these kind of DDR processes, these are negotiated processes, right? This isn't the UN, this isn't some other agency zooming down and saying, okay, here's how we're going to fix your society, right? They're negotiated by actors who are of and from those places, obviously with lots of outside influence, but ultimately governments play a very large role. Civil society groups often take a back seat. And so one interesting avenue that we identified based on the formal participation of women in armed groups is that women can actually have a more direct role at the peace table through their participation in these armed groups, rather than as civil society actors, which is how they've traditionally been treated, by asserting kind of their right to be track one, track two participants in the peace process, that opens greater space for them to influence the process. That being said, it doesn't guarantee outcomes. Those outcomes are still a product of the kind of social milieu that this is all taking place in. I think Timor is a fascinating case. So Timor, of the countries you listed, Timor is the place where I've spent time, so I'm going to speak to that. Also, it's a very recent case. So Timor is really interesting because, again, it's a kind of national liberation conflict, slightly leftist. I wouldn't push that, too far. We can differ on that perhaps. But certainly a national liberation movement in a twice over, three times over colony, depending how we look at it, very small population. When I spent time in Timor in 2011, right, this was after we had the kind of police, military, gunfights, all of this. One of the most pressing issues that NGOs were trying to address in Timor was domestic violence, right? And so that's something that I didn't mention in my presentation, that we don't get into in the book, but that is certainly an issue in El Salvador, that's certainly an issue in many, many post-conflict countries, right? Disruption of family life and family structures and domestic violence. Many studies of gang participation in El Salvador point to the weakness of family structures and the kind of disruption of traditional modes of social relations as one source for this kind of spike in alternative social mobilization and social units. But the question is, right, domestic violence is not a clearly identified cause or contributor to civil war, yet it is clearly an outcome, a social outcome of a society that has gone through conflict. So we've also seen this very extensively in the Balkans in the post-Civil War period, that we have these identifications of social issues that clearly stem from or are exacerbated by conflict, but that are not integrated into formal processes or agreements that stem from that conflict. So I think that this is another area that DDR processes and organizations like the UN could better integrate into their ongoing activities. And I think, again, this is a really important issue for foreign terrorist fighters, in part because ISIS had very explicit policies about enslavement, about forced captivity. Many of these groups resort to forced captivity and mistreatment and abuse of women and of children. And so we need to kind of be very, very explicit about how we're integrating domestic and sexual violence into our policies. On the question of what happens to returning foreign fighters if they are allowed back into the country, this is a very active and ongoing conversation. So I recently participated in a roundtable with representatives from Central Asian governments, and they were actively struggling with this question, right? So we have these folks, they're over there, they want to come back. We don't think that they did anything too bad. We're open to letting them return, but what do we do with them? We can't put them in our prisons because we already have a prison radicalization problem. We can't just put them back in their communities because maybe they'll just leave again, or maybe they'll radicalize. We can monitor them, but then we're going to be accused of repression and human rights abuses. And so I do think it is a really serious struggle for countries. What's happened in the past with civil wars that didn't have this international dimension is that oftentimes as part of the peace process, there's an amnesty for lower level fighters, essentially for grunts, and then the very high up military leaders, kind of political leaders, have some more criminal justice component integrated into their treatment, but those are oftentimes, not life imprisonment, not death, some shorter term kind of criminal justice component, because these are political resolutions to conflicts. But I think it's very difficult in the foreign terrorist fighter situation, and where we have had positive examples of kind of reintegration, particularly with the Aarhus program in Denmark, it's been unclear how developing countries in particular can bring these really resource-intensive, individualized reintegration programs to scale. They don't have the resources, and we certainly know that throwing these people in jails is just going to exacerbate a prison radicalization problem in countries throughout the Middle East, but also Indonesia. Oh, and the other question of what has been learned over time, I mean, Joshua Goldstein's book was already mentioned. He goes back to the Dahomey Kingdom, right? It's a very broad historical brush. I think one important thing that has been learned over time is that we still are very conflicted about women's agency, right? So even if we take the case of female suicide bombers, which has been studied by Robert Pape, Mia Bloom, many others in political science, right? We had the first female suicide bomber, I believe, in 1984 or 1985. So it's certainly a growing phenomenon, but it's not a new one. Scholars, I'm sure policymakers and others are very conflicted about women's agency. So Boko Haram in particular is known for often drugging suicide people before they are put on their suicide mission. We've known in Afghanistan and Pakistan where vests have been remotely detonated. We even saw in the theater siege in Moscow that women were the ones strapped with explosives but had no ability to detonate them. So that when the Russian military went in and took out the male fighters, the women just simply weren't detonated because they had no control over that. And so I think agency is still very problematic. And this is true also for some of the leftist egalitarian groups, which do also rely on kind of forced participation as well. And so I think it's less of a kind of what ideology is motivating participation and more what policies do the groups hold internally with respect to the treatment of individuals. But also it's very difficult to draw the line between, for example, being trafficked into a group and individuals who have followed relatives. So many of the stories of women in Boko Haram and Al-Shabaab and ISIS was that they followed their spouse, they followed their father, they followed their brother, because that was the only male relative that they had. And the outcome for them as a woman without a male relative to play a guardianship and economic function was potentially worse than joining the group. And I think the difficulty is, how do we, after the conflict, adjudicate those claims and establish culpability? And I have no easy solutions to that, but that's definitely something that many people are thinking deeply about.
So we are closing in on our time here. There's one question that did not get answered. I'm trying to be very diligent since people are waiting so patiently to ask, which was the integration of the UN evaluations, whether that plays a role. It's also probably an easy question to answer quickly. And then after that, if you both would like to just give us some final thoughts and concluding things for us to think about as we finish here.
Yeah, so we, because the book only focuses on these 3 cases and only one of them, the FARC have an actual demobilization process, that's the one that we looked at. And I think we offer general recommendations for DDR based on the FARC experience, but also informed by the experience of other cases. But I look forward to talking to you more about this, especially Timor. But also on women in national militaries. So 14% is amongst the highest for all national militaries. But it's interesting also to look at the way in which female participation in non-state armed groups has influenced national militaries. So for example, the Sri Lankan military formed a women's unit in response to the use of female combatants by the Tamil Tigers. So it is possible that women's participation in non-state armed groups affects women's participation in state groups as well. On the question of sexual assault and kind of hypermasculinity, Megan McKenzie has a very excellent book on this called Beyond the Band of Brothers that has come out. But I think I would definitely contest that women don't want to join. I think many women want to join, and in the United States in particular, the issue is not getting enough women to join, it's a leaky pipeline. It's retaining those women. It's making sure that they feel like they're valuable members of an institution. It's about making sure that they have opportunities for advancement and attainment. It's ensuring that they're not punished in terms of their career for pregnancy, for having children, for all of these other things that also, women can and oftentimes want to do. And so I think that it's unlikely that we'll reach parity in participation amongst men and women in national militaries anytime soon, but it is clear that the policies that these institutions adopt can make them more or less favorable to women's participation, but that relatively little has been done to ensure women's advancement through these institutions. And I mean, the same argument is often made for academia and other institutions as well, that there's a leaky pipeline and we need to be more creative about how to stop those leaks.
Thank you so much. Final comment?
The Marianne Tetreault book. I have a chapter there on Afghanistan, and ideology does matter, and the policies actually are influenced by ideology. And so there were women in prominent positions in Afghanistan under the left-wing government and the ruling party, the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, none among the Mujahideen who were supported by the United States. So that's one point I wanted to make. About the U.S. military, I think I agree with Heather, is it, about Canada and such. I'm not... Joshua Goldstein, in his earlier book on gender and war, also sort of made the argument that if there were more women in the U.S. military could change and could be less masculinist, less warlike, and so on and so forth. And I think that there are a lot of people today saying the same thing about gays and LGBT and so on and so forth. I'm not sure. I think there are differences in the world in terms of institutions. I think there's been much more change in academia, for example, with this huge influx of women in academia. a change to that institution called academia, than would be the case in the US military. I think the women would change. And there's actually, if you haven't seen this old film, G.I. Jane, I used to have my students watch that too, because you had this demure young woman from, the Naval Academy or something with her hair in the bun and a skirt and so on and so forth, and then she was forced to join the Navy SEALs as some kind of an experiment and some kind of weird interpretation of feminism. She turns out to be just like the guys. She crops her hair, she muscles herself up, she wears these fatigues, of course, as she has to. She uses bad language, and she helps invade Libya. So I think that might be. Last but not least, on the question of El Salvador, and I'm so glad that you raised that because it's really a very poignant case of a less than successful outcome. I'm wondering whether someone could do a doctoral dissertation comparing these Central American countries that went through civil conflict and had different outcomes. Why is it that El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras have some of the highest rates, not only of homicide, but femicide, and also this huge outflow of people from those countries to the United States, not Nicaragua? I know that Nicaragua's in a little bit of trouble these days. I have a different view on why that's the case. But Nicaragua neither has those very high rates of violence against women, and especially femicide, that the other Central American countries has, nor has it had this outflow of refugees and immigrants seeking asylum in America. I think that kind of a comparative study of these four Central American countries would be well worth a PhD.
I hope that graduate students are listening. Thank you so much for this fantastic panel, and please join me in thanking our panelists.